Good afternoon, everyone. Today's webinar will begin in about 5 minutes. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me clearly before we begin. So if you could use the chat box to confirm that you can hear me, that will be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's 2019-20 PARCC and DC Science Testing Accommodation Features webinar. My name is Michael Craig, and I serve as the Assessment Specialist for Special Populations at OSSE. And today we're going to spend some time talking about accommodations and accessibility features that are available on PARCC and DC Science. So our agenda, we're going to begin with a quick warm-up activity, followed by diving into accommodations versus accessibility features. What are accommodations exactly? What are accessibility features? And utilizing the accessibility systems to identify those. We're also going to discuss identifying accommodations for individual students and the decision-making process. So what steps should IEP teams as well as LEAs take to ensure that the correct accommodations are being identified? We're also going to spend some time discussing classroom accommodations versus statewide assessment accommodations. And finally, we're going to dive into dissecting 3 specific accommodations that require some individual attention and just additional clarification prior to administering the PARCC or DC Science assessment. So throughout today's presentation, if you have a question, please feel free to utilize the question or the chat feature. I will stop periodically between each section of the presentation just to check the messages to ensure that all questions are being answered. If I do not get to your question, feel free to send me an email at the end of today's webinar. I will provide you with my email address and my contact information if you have any additional questions or if your question was not answered today. All right, so before we dive in, I'm going to stop briefly to check the questions. I see that some questions have been posed, and I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. All right, so before we jump into the meat of today's presentation, on screen you have, and we're going to complete a quick activity. So on screen you see a series of accommodations and accessibility features. So I want you to take a brief moment to sort them into groups. So identify what the accessibility features are or what the accommodations are. So I'll give you a brief moment to do so. All right, so hopefully you were able to successfully sort them. When you put on screen now, you will see that I've divided them into 2 groups. So your accessibility features consist of line reader math tool, pop-up glossary, and the bookmark. And your accommodations are your human reader, human signer, extended time, as well as your calculation device. So again, hopefully you were able to correctly sort those. I know this can be a bit challenging to identify and differentiate between accessibility features and accommodations, but hopefully by the end of today's presentation, you will be able to successfully identify the process of differentiating between the 2. So exactly what are accessibility features and accommodations? So according to the PARCC Accessibility Features and Accommodations Manual 6th edition, accessibility features are tools or preferences that are either built into the assessment system or provided externally by the test administrators. Accessibility features can be used by any student taking the PARCC assessment. I think it's really important to remember that when utilizing an accessibility feature, it can be used by any student taking the PARCC assessment or the DC Science assessment. Accommodations are considered to be adjustments to the testing conditions, test format, or test administration that provide equitable access during assessments for students with disabilities and students who are English learners. But the key distinction between the 2, and the most important thing to remember, that students with disabilities are legally entitled to their accommodations. And those accommodations must be documented in the student's IEP in order for them to be receive them on the statewide assessments. In the District of Columbia, we administer the following statewide assessments. We have our PARCC ELA literacy, our PARCC mathematics assessment. Excuse me, we have the multi-state alternate assessment, also known as MSAA. We have our DC science assessment. We have our dynamic learning maps, also known as DLM. We have our WIDA access for ELL 2.0 assessment, as well as our WIDA alternate assessment for English learners 2.0. So as you can see, this table provides you with the standards that each assessment is aligned to, as well as the tested grades for each assessment. Again, during today's presentation, we're going to focus mainly on PARCC, ELA, and mathematics, as well as DC science and the accommodation and accessibility features that are available on those assessments. So when identifying and reviewing accommodations, you should utilize the PARCC Accessibility Features and Accommodations Manual 6th edition. This is going to be your guide and your go-to manual for all accommodations that are available to students on PARCC and DC Science. Although the ones that are for PARCC are not specifically listed out in this manual, they are similar, and there is guidance in here about DC Science. So you can also utilize this when identifying those accommodations. This manual provides, again, it's a qualifying criteria for each feature, and it goes into depth guidance on administering each feature. So it's definitely a key tool to utilize when preparing accommodations and accessibility features for students. We won't spend a lot of time today diving into the specific accommodations within the manual, but I definitely recommend downloading the manual and familiarizing yourself with it when it comes time to registering for accommodations in the personal needs profile and aligning those to what accommodations are available on a student's IEP. This manual can be found on the ACC website as well. Additionally, our DC Science assessment, there are accommodations and accessibility features that are available for DC Science. To identify those, we recommend using the Testing Accommodations Guide for students with disabilities. This Testing Accommodation Guide is a crosswalk for LEAs and schools to utilize. It lists all of the accommodations in SEDS and compares it to the accommodations that are available on PARCC, ELA, Math, and as well as DC Science, MSAA, DLM, and our access testing. So this is a great resource to use when you are aligning both accommodations that are available in SED as well as what's on PARCC and DC Science. So again, this is the accommodations guide for students with disabilities, Part 1. There is also a Part 2 for English learners, as well as a guide for administrative considerations. Again, it provides qualifying criteria for each accommodation, and also it's just important to remember that when you're identifying accommodations, the accommodation should never reduce learning expectations by reducing the scope, complexity, or rigor of the assessment. This testing accommodation guide can be found on the ACC website as well. So the accessibility system provides you with 3 areas to focus on when identifying accommodations. So our outer circle is the accessibility features. These are, again, available to all students and is built into the test. The inner circle is accessibility features selected for each student, and they are identified in advance. And then our smaller circle are our accommodations for students with IEPs, 504 plans, or EL plans. So going back to the accessibility features, the outer circle, this assessment platform includes several accessibility features built into the system that all students can access at any time. Again, that's the most important distinction for accessibility features, is that it is for all students. And we will dive into the next slide on examples of each of these. Accessibility features that are identified in advance. So these are additional features that are available to any student in need of a feature, but must be specifically selected in the student registration for planning purposes. And then finally, we have our accommodations for students with IEPs, 504 plans, and EL plans. Certain accommodations are available only to students with disabilities, so they must have a documented individual education plan or a Section 504 plan, and others, students with EL plans. Accommodations must be documented in the student's IEP, 504, or EL plan, and also needs to be in the student's personal needs profile. So the personal needs profile will be completed by your LEA, by your school, prior to registering for the PARCC and DC Science assessments. So some examples of each type of feature that we just discussed. So for your accessibility feature, some examples consist of a pop-up glossary, external spell check, line reader tool, and repetition of directions. Examples of accessibility features that must be identified in advance for them to be turned on in the system include the text-to-speech for math assessment, color contrast, frequent breaks, and small group testing. It's also important to remember that frequent breaks and small group testing are administrative considerations, and they can be identified by the school or the LEA. Accommodations consist of read aloud for ELA, human signer for test directions, calculation device, and screen reader for ELA literacy. And some specific accommodations for English learners would be a word-to-word dictionary and a translation of math to Spanish. So these are the examples of each of these focus areas in the accessibility system. A more depth overview of the accommodations and/or accessibility features can be found in the manual that was discussed earlier, as well as the crosswalk. When assigning accommodation and/or accessibility features, it's important to remember that there are only 4 distinct groups of students that may receive these accommodations. So, of course, your first group are students with IEPs, followed by students with 504 plans. Next, your students who are identified as English learners, and then your last group will be your English learners with disabilities who have an IEP or 504 plan. They will be eligible for both sets of accommodations, either for students with disabilities or for English learners. So honestly, this is one of my favorite images to use when discussing accommodations. And it's a great way to explain the use of accommodations and accessibility features. So we have an image, you see your left side, we have 3 individuals trying to watch a baseball game. However, they're all standing on the same size box, but they're all different heights. And the shortest individual is unable to see the game, even though he has a box, but he's still unable to see the game. That's identified or defined as equality, equality, because they all have the same size box, but yet the student is still unable to see the game. On the right side, we have the tallest individual now does not have a box and is given this box to the shortest individual, allowing him to see the game. So now all 3 individuals are able to see the game. So this is defined as equity. So that's when we want to think about accommodations and accessibility features, we want to level the playing field, which allows students with disabilities the opportunity to be successful on the assessment in the same manner as their non-disabled peers. So this is just a great way, simple way to just define and explain what accommodations do for our students with disabilities. All right, so before we proceed to the next session, I'm going to take a moment to review the questions in the chat box and hopefully answer any questions that were posed. Okay, so we have a participant ask, can the slides be shared right now? The slides will not be shared at the moment. However, they will be posted. The recording and the slide will be posted to the IC website within a week or so. We will also send out information via the NGA bulletin about how to access the slides, or just a reminder saying that the slides and the recordings are on the website if you would like to view them at another time. Another question was asked, when can we start assigning accommodations in the personal needs profile? I will have to check with my colleague, my teammate, Cassie Lynett, about when the Pearson Access Next opens. I believe it's open now. However, I'm not confident, but I know that the registration file is due at the end of February. If you want to reach directly out to Cassie, she will be able to provide you with additional information about when PAN opens. But I do not want to provide you with the incorrect information. But again, she has more information about when it opens and what steps schools need to take to ensure that the accommodations are entered in correctly. She can be reached at cassie.lynett@dc.gov. Okay, so our next section, identifying accommodations for individual students. So when selecting accommodations and accessibility features, the IEP team is responsible for selecting those features and accommodations for English learners and students with disabilities. They should follow the following steps, or just keep this in mind when identifying those. So identify which accessibility feature and accommodation might support a student during daily instruction. So it's important to remember that these accommodations should have been utilized throughout the entire school year. Students should not be introduced to new accommodations to participate in PARCC or DC Science. They should have been incorporated into daily instruction, and students should have already been familiar with said accommodations. Students should be able to try out the accessibility feature or accommodation during instruction in that content area. So again, making sure that they are familiar, making sure that it's beneficial to the student. If the accommodations are not beneficial, or the student is not utilizing the accommodation on their IEP, the IEP team should hold a 30-day review meeting to adjust the accommodation and find out what works best for the student. Evaluate the effectiveness of the feature or accommodation. Again, so trying out during daily instruction, using those accommodations during classroom assessments, and if they are not working for the student or they do not benefit the student's needs, again, reevaluate and identify those accommodations that work best and will work best on the statewide assessment. And finally, determine which should be used on PARCC or DC Science based on what the student is currently using in the classroom. So when making decisions about accommodations and accessibility features, PARCC, there are considerations for selecting PARCC and DC Science assessment accommodations for students with disabilities, English learners, and English learners with disabilities. So the PARCC manual has laid out a table with the factors that IEP teams and EL teams should take into consideration. So you first have to identify the student's characteristics. So that includes what are the characteristics of the students, meaning what do the students need, followed by what accommodations does the student regularly use in classroom for instruction and assessment. So that's understanding what works best for the student's needs. If the student is using extended time in the classroom and on classroom-based assessment, most likely the student will benefit from utilizing extended time on statewide assessment. And then finally, has the student indicated preference in using the accommodation? What input have teachers or parents or guardians given? So it's also important to remember that since the students are using these accommodations on a daily basis or should be using them on a daily basis in their classroom, it's important to ask them their input. How do they feel about the accommodation? Is it necessary? Do they need them? Is it improving their instruction? Is it helping them on classroom-based assessments? After you identify the student characteristics, you have to identify the individual test characteristics. So what tasks are being required of the student? What is the test designed to measure? So again, what is the test asking the student to do? If they're solving mathematic problems, will they require the use of a calculator? Is that a part of their IEP? Will they benefit from a calculator, or will it hinder them? Next, you have to identify if the accommodations are already being used in the classroom assessments that match the accommodations that needed to remove barriers on the statewide assessment. So that would fall into looking instead, utilizing the crosswalk to see what accommodations are used and identify on a student's IEP and what are available on the DC Science or PARCC assessment, and aligning those accommodations and making sure that the student is using them and knows how to use them. And lastly, are there accommodations that could be made available to the student in the classroom that are not available currently that would remove barriers to the test? So that would fall into if there are accommodations that the student and the team believes would benefit them on their test, but may not necessarily be in the student's IEP, identifying those additional ones. And that could even fall into maybe a unique accommodation request, which we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. And then a final factor would be the PARCC accommodation policy. So we want to make sure that accommodations maintain validity of the assessment. We have to make sure that, ask yourself, is the accommodation allowed for the test or portion of the test noted as a barrier? And are there consequences for using the accommodations? We just want to make sure that any accommodation used by a student is valid and will not hinder the student. It will not cause the scores to be invalidated. So diving a little deeper into student characteristics, and access needs impact the selection of accessibility features and accommodations. Accessibility features and accommodations should remove barriers to learning. So that's our key takeaway from the student's characteristics. We want to make sure that their accommodations and accessibility features are removing those barriers. So you think about the student's characteristic. What makes up the students? How are they successful in the classroom, or what is preventing them from being successful in the classroom on assignments or teacher-made tests or quizzes? And then you discuss their needs, identify specific accommodations, and ensure that valid measures of what the student knows and can do. So we want to make sure that those accommodations validate what the student knows and can do and supports their needs within the classroom and on statewide assessment. Diving into individuals' test characteristics, you're going to examine the tasks students are being asked to do on the PARCC or DC Science assessment. So that really is identifying the questions and the makeup of the assessment and ensuring that the student can be successful in those tasks being asked on the assessment. And a good way to look at that is having your students utilize the practice assessments built into the platform. That's a great way to see if they are prepared for DC Science or PARCC. From there, you identify the characteristics of the assessment. So again, that's talking about the makeup of the questions, looking at the standards and seeing if the students can be successful in those areas, followed by the assessment tasks and classroom assessment task similarities. So comparing those tasks being asked on the statewide assessment to what is being taught in the classroom, if those align. Assessment accessibility features and accommodations similarity. So again, are there similar accommodations on the statewide assessment? Are there any similarities to those used in the classroom? And is the student familiar with those? And finally, existing barrier removal by using accessibility features and accommodations, making sure that anything utilized by the student is removing those barriers to help them be successful on both assessments. And lastly, it's important to remember that there are PARCC and DC Science accessibility features and accommodation policies. So there are guiding questions for these accessibility features and accommodation selection. So when your IEP team meets to discuss what should be used on the statewide assessment for the students, you should utilize these guiding questions. So one, what are the students' learning strengths and challenges? And are these based on language needs, a disability, or both? Two, which accessibility features and/or accommodations are regularly used by the student during instruction and assessment? Again, that just goes back to the point, driving home that these accommodations should have been used since day one during instruction, not just prior to the administration of DC Science or PARCC. What difficulties did the student experience when using accessibility features and/or accommodations? We know that if you're introducing a new accommodation or accessibility feature to the student, that they may struggle initially or not be as successful as the team thought. So identifying those challenges, documenting those challenges, and if the student is not being successful with this new feature or accommodation, amending the IEP and identifying something that will benefit the student in the classroom and on the assessment. Next, should an existing accessibility feature and/or accommodation be implemented differently? So with those that are listed on the student's IEP, are there different ways to implement that specific accommodation? Again, it's all about what is going to work best for the student and meet the student's needs. And finally, what specialized instruction is required by the student to achieve grade level or course content, Common Core State Standards, or Next Generation Science Standards? So what needs to be written in the student's IEP to help them achieve the grade level standards for Common Core or Next Generation Science Standards? Additionally, the PARCC manual lists more questions, guiding questions that IEP teams can ask during their meetings. These are just some that I wanted to highlight that are some of the most important and that may be the most beneficial during your meetings. All right, so before our next section, I'm going to stop to review the chat box and the question box. All right, so our next section is we'll be discussing classroom versus statewide assessment accommodations. So we know that students are allowed accommodations within the classroom and on statewide assessments. Some of those accommodations may be the same, where others may differ. So it's important to remember that accommodations should never reduce learning expectation by reducing the scope, complexity, or rigor of the classroom assessment. Accommodations should be consistent with those provided for classroom instruction and classroom assessment, provide equitable access during instruction and assessment, mitigate the effects of a student's disability, not reduce performance expectations, and not change the construct being assessed. So these are just key factors to remember when identifying classroom accommodations for students. The IEP team, 504, or EL team should discuss which accessibility features and accommodations might assist a student during daily instruction, determine which accessibility feature or accommodation to try out with the student during instruction, document and evaluate the effectiveness of the accessibility feature and accommodation. I think this is a key point to remember: the evaluation and evaluating the effectiveness of the accessibility feature or accommodation. So if a student has a new accommodation introduced, the teachers, IEP team, any related service provider should use a type of evaluation system to monitor the student's progress, at least a 60-day trial period to see if the accommodation is actually being effective. If not, again, reconvene a meeting to amend the IEP to try new accommodations. The IEP team, EL team should also adjust the student's use of the accommodation during instruction and determine which accessibility feature and accommodation to use on PARCC and or DC Science based on the classroom results. So again, it all ties into that evaluation of the effectiveness of that accommodation, if they need more of it, if it needs to be reduced, and just monitoring the student's progress with said accommodation. Statewide accessibility features and accommodations should not be assigned broadly to all students with the same disability. So this is a practice that we have observed at OSSE, but should not be performed by schools and LEAs. So accommodations should be assigned on an individual basis by the student's individual needs and what will work best for each student. We should not see your entire grade or entire class of students all receiving the same accommodation because you feel like they will be successful if you just give them everything. Again, you have to identify what's going to work best for each individual student. It's also important to remember that the IEP, 504, or EL team should discuss accessibility features and accommodations separately for each PARCC and DC Science content area assessment. Select accessibility features and accommodations that increase a student's access to the assessment and remove barriers. Obtain student input when selecting accessibility features and accommodations. So we touched on this earlier, but I like this distinction or this factor of obtaining input from that student, especially our students in middle and high school, getting their feedback on what they need to use or what they want to see or what helps them be most successful on statewide assessments. And lastly, avoiding the use of the kitchen sink method that provides students with unnecessary or mutually contradictory accommodations. So again, not assigning all accommodations instead. So I know some of you have seen IEPs where all the accommodations instead have just been selected. because the IEP team made the decision that this is going to help the student. But actually, it may hinder the student. It may prevent them from being academically successful on a statewide assessment. So again, driving home the point of focusing on individualized student accommodations. What is going to help each individual student be successful versus assigning or over-assigning accommodations. All right, so I'm going to take a quick break to check questions and the chat box. Okay, so a question was asked by a participant about materials being available for print. All materials that have been discussed during today's presentation are available on OSSE's website. So if you are looking for the accommodations manual or the accommodations crosswalk for students with disabilities, it's all on the testing accommodations page on the OSSE website. Again, the slides and the recording will also be posted to the OSSE website at a later date. We'll send out information via the NGA bulletin about when you can access those materials on the site. All right, so in this section, we're going to discuss 3 specific accommodations. So dissecting specific accommodations that we have found to need additional support and just additional guidance. All right, so the first being read aloud for ELA literacy assessment. So that is the title of the accommodation in SEDS, and in the PARCC manual, it is text-to-speech, ASL video, human reader, human signer, and this is for PARCC ELA. So this accommodation uses a human reader, a human signer, or text-to-speech function to hear the test questions and passages read aloud for ELA literacy assessment. So with this one, I think most people are probably familiar with the text-to-speech function built into the platform. This is intended for a very small number of students with print-related disabilities who would otherwise be unable to participate in the assessment. It's very key to, that's a key distinction that it is intended for a small number of students. The student's disability severely limits or prevents their ability to access printed text by decoding, and is not intended for a student reading somewhat, so i.e. moderately below grade level. And there must be observable attempts to teach the student how to decode printed text. So for the read aloud ELA accommodation, this is intended for a small population of students. These are honestly intended for students who are unable to read printed text, students that are almost unable to identify letters, any type of vocabulary, and are more than just your struggling reader. And it's also important to remember that before assigning this accommodation, you need to have supporting documentation in SEDS about students' ability or their inability to identify text or decode, and have some type of evidence to show that the attempts made to teach the student how to decode printed text. An example would be if you have reports from computer-based interventions. If your school may use System 44 or PRC or some type of report that can be generated and uploaded into SED to say that this student is actually in need of this accommodation because they are unable to decode printed text. The next accommodation we're going to dive into would be calculation device on non-calculator section. So that is the title and says the title of the accommodation in the PARCC manual will be calculation device and mathematics tools on non-calculator sections. This accommodation provides access for students with a disability that severely limits or prevents their ability to perform basic calculations. Meaning the student is unable to perform single-digit addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. The student's inability to perform math calculation is documented in evaluation summaries from locally administered diagnostic assessments. And the student receives ongoing intensive instruction and/or interventions to learn to calculate without using a calculator. So again, I think the most important aspect to remember about this accommodation and for students that you believe will need this accommodation is that they are unable to perform single-digit subtraction, multiplication, or division. So again, student is struggling more than a moderate degree in mathematics, and they are truly unable to perform those single function calculations. And similar to the read aloud, this documentation instead should be uploaded to show that there have been attempts to teach the student how to perform those calculations, but the student is unable to do so. And our next accommodation that requires some additional guidance would be the text-to-speech for math and science. That's what it says. The title would be text-to-speech for math and science, but in the PARCC manual, it will read the human reader, human signer accessibility feature for math and science. So this means the student uses a human reader, human signer, text-to-speech function, or audio file to hear the test questions. When assigning this accommodation, students should be grouped together with those taking the same test form. The human reader for math is also an accessibility feature. But for additional guidance on this one, you should refer to the Appendix B in the PARCC Accessibility Features and Accommodations Manual. This is also intended for a small subset of students, not intended for a large population or your moderate students performing moderately below grade level in the area of math or science. And lastly, we're just going to touch on unique accommodations. We started talking about it earlier, but just providing additional information about unique accommodation requests. So students may require a unique non-standard accommodation that is not listed on the IEP and does not change the construct being measured by the test. This is allowable for students that require those types of accommodations. The IEP team should complete the form submitted to the LEA, and the LEA should return the form to the OSCE assessment team at least 4 weeks prior to the school testing or beginning the test. The 1920 unique accommodation request form can be found also on the OSCE website. It's also important to remember that unique accommodations are intended to support the student's ability to perform on a statewide assessment, and also that there are some requests that could potentially invalidate a student's score and may not be approved or would not be approved. For example, an accommodation such as testing units over multiple days. When an example like that there may be implications of test security and may invalidate the student's score, so we would not approve a unique request such as that. All right, so I'm going to stop and then give you guys the opportunity to pose any questions. Feel free to write everything in the chat and any thoughts that you may have. Okay, so I see a couple of questions regarding the size of a small group or small group testing. It's going to depend on your school, honestly, and your LEA, and what how you can meet the needs of your testing group. So we would recommend no more than 8 students in a small group. Another question regarding the type of calculators that are available. These calculators, depending on the tested grades, they can utilize the calculator device built into the platform, or they can use a 4-function calculator. But it's also recommended that the students utilize the calculator device that's built into the platform. There's a question regarding the human reader or text to speech as an accessibility feature. That is the human reader text to speech for math and science questions, not for ELA. And there are questions about unique accommodations, what type might be approved. So if a student might need to use a something like a fidget or some type of a specialized seat or something to help them stay focused during the assessment, something like that would be approved. If you have specific questions about types of accommodations or unique accommodations, definitely complete that request form, submit it to OSSE, and we will review to determine if it is allowed on the assessment. soft music is a unique accommodation request, so please submit that to OSSI. We will have to review and determine if that will be allowed or not. Again, all unique accommodation request forms can be found on the OSSI website under the Testing Accommodations page. All right, so I don't see any additional questions coming in. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Michael Craig. I serve as the Assessment Specialist for Special Populations. I can be reached at michael.craig@dc.gov or 202-257-3371. Again, just want to thank you for participating in today's PARCC and DC Science Testing, Accommodations, and Accessibility Features webinar. Again, the webinar will be recorded and posted to the OSSI website for you to review at a later date. Additional information will be released through the NGA bulletin about how to access the recording, and any documents that was discussed today can also be found on the OSSI website. If there are no additional questions, that will wrap up today's webinar. Thank you for participation, and you guys have a great day.